Good. So what I'm going to do is just to set again the framework under which the Commission proposal was presented. As you know, and it has been mentioned by Mr. Niedermeyer, there is a need to restore the confidence in the markets, in the integrity of the benchmarks. There is a need to enhance the robustness and reliability of the benchmarks and facilitate the prevention to detect any possible manipulation, clarify responsibilities for supervision. And all this is due to the fact that regulators in the European Union, some member states, the European Commission with regard to competition policy and other third country jurisdictions have found out that there was evidence of manipulation, evidence of anti-competitive behavior. And this is not only in the area of interest rate benchmarks, which some people consider as being the most important ones, but also investigations have been undertaken in the field of fixed income, in the field of exchange rate benchmarks, and in the field of commodities. And on commodities, even a few weeks ago, the Commission published an inspection, antitrust inspection in the biofuel industry sector. So taking all this into consideration, taking into consideration also the fact that IOSCO had produced the principles on benchmarks, we were following it closely, the Commission decided to put forward a proposal in line with the IOSCO principles in order to regulate this area and, as I said, to restore the confidence in the financial markets, because just to say that the proposal covers benchmarks that are used to reference financial instruments admitted to trading or traded on a regulated market, covers also commodity benchmarks in this regard, and also benchmarks which are used in financial contracts such as mortgages or consumer loans, or benchmarks that are used to measure performance of investment funds. And just to say that even if the scope is in particular financial instruments admitted to trading in venues, some of these benchmarks are used also in the physical markets. So it's not only the issue of financial markets, but there is a real impact in the physical markets, in particular, of course, on commodity markets. So which are the key areas, and I will highlight 6 areas of this proposal, and most of them in line with the IOSCO principles. So the first one is to improve the governance and controls over the benchmark process. And for this, benchmarks, the provision of benchmarks, this activity, which is to provide benchmarks, will be subject to prior authorization and ongoing supervision. Of course, this element is not in the IOSCO principles, because the IOSCO principles were just principles. But the proposal requires substantial requirements with regard to improving this governance and control of conflicts of interest, and those are based on the IOSCO principles. So administrators should avoid conflicts of interest, and when not possible to avoid them, manage them and disclose them. Second area of the proposal is to improve the quality of the input data and methodologies used by benchmarks. Again, this element comes from the IOSCO principle, so sufficient and accurate data has to be used, and they have to represent this data, or the benchmark has to represent the actual market or economy reality that the benchmark is intended to measure. The data should come from reliable sources. Benchmarks should be calculated in a robust and reliable way with robust methodologies. And it is said, as stated in the IOSCO principle, that transaction data are to be used when possible, but when it's not possible, it will have to be verifiable. Third area is that the proposal intends to ensure that contributors to benchmarks provide adequate data and are subject to adequate control. So it goes towards the contributors by requiring that the administrator produces a code of conduct to which those contributors have to comply. In the proposal, it is said that it has to be signed by the contributors in order to make sure that the data provided complies with the rules established by the administrator. And also, there are some rules concerning possible conflicts of interest within the contributor entity. Fourth area is to ensure an adequate protection for consumers and investors using benchmarks. And here is this element of the users. We have introduced a statement that the administrator will have to provide in order to explain what the benchmark intends to measure and what are the vulnerabilities. And we have introduced a provision by which, in the proposal, a provision by which the supervised entities, banks, when signing financial contracts, will have to assess the suitability for consumers in order to make sure that that benchmark is appropriate for the specific contract and the specific consumer in the specific case. In addition, also, we have introduced in the proposal specific provisions concerning the transparency of the data. Fifth area relates to the supervision and the viability of critical benchmarks. This area, of course, is different from the IOSCO principles, because here in the EU proposal we have introduced this concept of critical benchmarks in order to introduce, let's say, some proportionality with regard to the application of some requirements. And, of course, those benchmarks that should be considered critical for the European Union would be subject to a college of supervisors with ESMA playing a key role, including, in case of disagreement, binding mediation. And an important power that we have introduced in this proposal is the power for the relevant competent authority to compel contributors to continue contributing to the specific benchmark. And this is only a power for the critical benchmark. In addition, I would say that, yes, the proposal includes some annexes with specific requirements for specific type of benchmarks, commodity benchmarks at this stage, and interest rate benchmarks. And there are also empowerments in order to modify these annexes. And the intention here was twofold. First one, to make sure that any development at FSB level, at IOSCO level, was possible for the EU to integrate it in the legislation as soon as possible. And then the second was, again, to allow for the possibility to further detail some requirements in case this was necessary, also following IOSCO developments or following requests by the supervisory authorities or ESMA. In addition, in terms of proportionality, I would say that also the proposal introduces specific requirements for benchmarks which input data is coming from regulated venues in order to avoid dual regulation, because, of course, dual regulation is something that goes against the better regulation principle and should be avoided. Sixth area, third country regime. When the Commission presented the proposal more than 1 year ago, it was September last year, the IOSCO principles had just been published, 2 months, mid-July 2013. Therefore, the Commission considered that the best way to implement those principles at EU level was to codify those principles in a proposal, in a piece of legislation. However, we can regulate the EU companies, but we need to make sure that all benchmarks used in the EU, with regard to the scope of the regulation, comply with similar requirements in order to make sure that there is a level playing field and in order precisely to avoid a problem in the financial system due to an element that is not regulated in a third country. That's the reason why we introduced in the proposal the traditional equivalence provisions. But in this case, we went a step forward. Why? Because as the proposal was based on the IOSCO principles, we have used the IOSCO principles as a benchmark for this equivalence assessment of third countries' legal framework and regulatory practices. What I can say is that at the moment we have seen that there are similar initiatives to the one undertaken by the European Commission in Japan, Singapore, India, Hong Kong, Canada. We don't know which other initiatives are coming. As Alp mentioned, there is also the IOSCO review in order to assess how the implementation of IOSCO principles is being undertaken. Therefore, we have to follow really what is happening at international level. But what is clear is that in the EU legal framework should not discriminate in terms of introducing a regulatory framework, an authorization framework, and ongoing supervision for EU benchmarks, but allowing third country benchmarks not to be regulated or just self-certified through IOSCO. So, and then to conclude, I would say, as it has been mentioned already, that the benchmarks are at the heart of the financial system, and as said, also real economy in terms of physical markets. It is necessary to restore the confidence and integrity of these benchmarks to rebuild the trust. That's the reason why we consider the scope should be broad, that the benchmark providers should be authorized and supervised, and it would be necessary really to enhance the transparency and to tackle any possible issue on conflicts of interest. So is the integrity as well as the continuity and quality of the key benchmarks that needs to be ensured. We have done a lot of work already in the market abuse framework because this piece of legislation, the market abuse regulation and the directive on criminal sanctions for market abuse have already been adopted, but that one relates only to market manipulation. Now we consider that more needs to be done in terms of the governance of those benchmarks. And for that reason, the Italian presidency, and here Mrs. Tambucci, the representative of the Italian presidency and the parliament, will have two representatives, I think, in these sessions, will be negotiating hard, we hope, in order to achieve as soon as possible an agreement and to make sure that this confidence on the benchmarks is being restored. Thank you.